talking about the power. That's supposed to have been changed. See, already. The purpose of the incarnation really is what this is supposed to be. You know, and that's an important thing, especially if you consider that this is the time that Yeshua was born into the earth. Of course, we recognize that life begins when? Life really begins in conception. So even if he was born today, the things started happening about 9 months ago, really, right? That's when he really entered into the world in a special and powerful way. You know, we had a great night starting the Sukkot last night. We had about 22 over at the house. So Tabernacles and such, it's a season of joy and celebration. And we just want to make sure that this whole week is supposed to be that. But man, it can be stressful leading up to it, can't it? Oh, yeah. Especially if you don't feel like you're prepared, if you don't have everything ready, you think of all the things to do. And that's what's been swirling around in my head like the last several days. And so it's been hard to nail down exactly how to share and what to talk about with all of this. You know, we talked about this being is one of the better times, or one of the more likely times, at least at one of the feast days for Yeshua's birth. And so one of the clues, at least that's a possible clue for why we look at that, why we talk about that, is in the Gospel of John. And we see that in John chapter 1, verse 14. You know, it says, "And the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. We looked upon his glory, the glory of the one and only from the Father, full of grace and truth." You know, this is following that passage in verse 1 where he says, in the beginning, you know, paralleling Genesis, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Right? And this Word, which was God, became flesh and dwelt, tabernacled among us. You know, the word for tabernacles is skeno. I'm probably saying that wrong. But it means, you know, to fix one's tabernacle, or to have a tabernacle, to abide, to live in this tabernacle or tent. And, you know, fixing your tent, some of us had to do that yesterday, others have it easier. But when you fix your tent, what do you have to do? You have to secure it to a specific location for a period of time, right? You're fixing it there. You're nailing it in there. You're dwelling there. Right? And this means, you know, for him, as it does for us, that, you know, where we're at is not necessarily our permanent place. Right? Where we're living, our existence is not necessarily our final state and such. And so this is the same for him. This world is not his home. And in reality, is it really our home either? No, it's really not. So in a lot of ways, just as he is tabernacling here with us, we are tabernacling here. We have to realize that our final place, our home, is his presence and where he is. But for this period of time, while we are here tabernacling on this earth, he is going to tabernacle with us. And it's through the incarnation, through that tabernacling, that God is able to dwell with his people. And that's one of the benefits of having, you know, a tent, is that it's not a permanent fixture. It has the ability to be picked up and moved or carried around from place to place as it's needed. You know, if one place turns out it's like, you know what, this is really not the best place for me, I can pick it up, I can move it and transport it. It's not like a brick and mortar home. It's not like a building, not like a temple that has, you know, the foundation and walls that are not meant to be moved. But with the temple, you know, when you think about that, it was in a fixed location, a fixed place. That was, the people were supposed to come to him. They were supposed to, you know, draw near to him in that regard. But in the minds of many of Yeshua's day, you know, it was the presence of God that was filling that temple. And the temple was a sign of God's presence. and the sign that he was with them as a people. And so long as they had the temple, they had that assurance. And that's why when you hear and you speak and you talk to, or you know people that are living in Israel to this day, Jewish people to this day living in Israel, don't necessarily believe they're back from exile yet. Even though they are in the land, even though they are living there, they still don't understand or believe that they are back from exile because God's presence is not there yet. The temple is not there with them yet. But that temple, it was a fixture. It was that fixed point. It was like this mountain. It was strong. It was intimidating. It was beautiful. It was powerful. Much like God's presence, in coming down on Mount Sinai. There's the thundering. There's the lightning. The inspiring that awe, inspiring that respect, inspiring that, man, I better keep my distance. I don't want to get too close to that. Right? That was much of the attitude. Moses, you go and talk to him up there. We're not going to come any closer. But the tabernacle, with all of its furnishings and all the things that were there, was different. As was its purpose. The tabernacle allowed the presence of God to dwell with them, within them, and also travel with and among them. So wherever he leads, what's that song? Wherever he leads, I'll go. Well, he was leading from within them, right amongst them. It wasn't a fixed point off in the distance. He was right there with them. And so where the people of Israel went, that tabernacle went with them. You look at some of those passages back in Exodus 25. It says, have them make a sanctuary for me. And here's the purpose. So that I may dwell among them. They were not, as a people, had already demonstrated, they were not ready. They could not go up into his presence. They could not go up the mountain at that time to be with him. So he was going to come down and be among them, so that I may dwell among them. That's the purpose of the tabernacle. He says, I will meet with Bnei Israel there, so it will be sanctified by my glory. And glory is important. He says, so I will dwell among Bnei Israel and be their God. That's verse 45. Did I skip that one? Yeah. I will meet with you there. I will speak with you from above the atonement covenant. See, I'm skipping ahead sometimes. So God is speaking. When he says all of this, he's talking to Moses. And where is God when he's saying all of these things to Moses? Isn't he at the top of the mountain? He's up there where everybody is afraid to go, unwilling to come any closer. He's there in the fire and the smoke, in the lightning and the thunder. He is distant from the people, and it's so intimidating they're afraid. The only person who's allowed to get up there is Moses. But God wants to be closer than that. He wants more than that. He wants to be closer than that. And Moses, I want to be down there. I want to be down there among the people so I can meet with them and so they can hear my voice, so they can make sense of my voice, so they can participate in relationship with me. And so in many ways, the tabernacle was closer, it was more personal, it was allowing God to move from the mountaintop above to the people beneath so that he could be among them. Does that sound familiar? What were we just singing about with Emmanuel? It means what? God with us. That is the hope. The incarnation, the Word becoming flesh, worked in much the same way. And so by becoming flesh, taking on the form of a man, God was able to interact, to speak, to move around with, without all the smoke, without all of the fire, without all of the thunder. Yeshua, he lays aside those attributes in order to dwell among us. We see Paul talking about that in Philippians chapter 2. He's talking about our attitudes, how we are supposed to be. We are supposed to be like him. But what was his attitude? How did he demonstrate his attitude in serving and living in this world? He says, have this attitude in yourselves, which also was in Messiah Yeshua, who though existing in the form of God, did not consider being equal to God a thing to be grasped. But he emptied himself, taking on the form of a slave, becoming the likeness of men, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself, becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So existing in the form of God, that's consistent with that statement that we just talked about in John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He already existed in that form. He already existed as God. That's some of the misconceptions, some of the false teachings and things that are out there was that even Yeshua himself was a created being. That's not what the Scripture says. He already was God. This is a continual possession. This is a continual nature. And it's not violating echad, the concept of echad, the oneness of God. That's not being broken or contradicted. Yeshua himself talked about that. He says, I and the Father are echad, are one. He said that in, I'm missing the chapter now. But Yeshua was on top of, Yeshua, his presence as God was there at Mount Sinai. He already lived and existed in that position and place, and he was demonstrating that desire to descend. That what was happening there at Sinai in the building of the tabernacle was a picture of what was going to happen in the incarnation. And he says, it's existing in the form of God, did not consider being equal to God a thing to be grasped. And that's an unusual phrase. A lot of people get tripped up on it sometimes. Sometimes the English doesn't help. It almost gives the picture. Some people try to take it this way: as a kid, who's a short kid standing on the floor in the kitchen. He's looking up on the countertop, and there's a big plate of cookies up there. Anybody have this memory or this experience? Right? No, I'm the only one who was tempted by a plate of cookies or something in the kitchen. And the attitude is, you're looking at the cookies and they're just kind of out of reach. You might be able to get them, but you might need some help to get there. And so they're there, and you're thinking, if only I could just get that cookie. And some people interpret this passage in the same way. Yeshua was like, oh, if only I could grasp and hold on to or be the status of God. But that's not how Yeshua was. He was not saying, oh, if only I could get equality with God. In fact, it's the exact opposite. This equality with God was something already in his possession. It was already in his hand. He wasn't having to try to get it or acquire it or hold on to it. It already was his. And in this sense, it's talking about, it's not something that is to be held on to. Equality with God was already his. So he didn't have to try to get a hold of it. Think of it like this. When we have something and we think it's valuable, if we have something that we want or we want to keep, when you think about when a kid sneaks a cookie or a toy or something that they're not supposed to have and he gets caught. Anybody have this happen to them or you've seen it? You get caught having it and then they get told to put it back. What do they usually do? Don't they kind of grab onto it even tighter and like, no, I don't want to put it back. I just got this thing. That's how we are. That's our nature. When we have something we're not supposed to have, we try to cling to it and hold on to it even tighter. But Yeshua was not afraid of losing something here. He was not afraid of losing something that he already possessed. Yeshua was not like some insecure person who always tried to make sure that everybody knew how important he was. No, this equality with God is about one's nature, about his nature, his identity, and it's something that could never change. But Yeshua was doing something different. He's not clinging to it in that regard. He's taking on a different form, and it's not really for his benefit that he's doing this. He's not doing it for himself. He is doing it for our benefit. The theological term for this is called kenosis. That is that, you'll see it here, it says he humbled himself, or he emptied himself, up there in verse 7. And emptied is, people get tripped up over that one too. In New International, the NIV translates it, the passage that he made himself nothing. The King James translates it like this: he made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. The word empty, keno, means to empty, to make empty, or lay aside. You already have it. In order to lay something aside, you have to already have it. But I really like the second translation of it, or second meaning of it, which means to deprive of force, or make of no effect. This thing is falling, isn't it? I'm feeling like I'm having a duck. And I like this statement, depriving of force, or making of no effect. All of those attributes of God and his presence, all of that glory, that knocks people to the ground, essentially. All that reputation, all that intimidation that goes before him, all that he could rightfully claim. Doesn't he have the right to claim all of those things? As the creator of the universe? Yes, he does. All of those things that he could rightfully claim, the incarnation, the Word becoming flesh, deprived that of its force, of its power, of its magnitude. When Moses came away from the presence of the Lord, y'all remember what happened to him when he was meeting with the Lord at the tabernacle? He would step away from that, and what happened to his face? It would glow, right? There was not really a great word for it, but he was shining with that glory that he had in the presence of God. And so what did Moses have to do so people didn't freak out whenever they looked at him? Right, he put the veil over his face. He covered it. Did he ever stop? Just because he put the veil over the mask, dare I say? No, I don't want to say that. But just because he put the mask over his face, did he ever cease being Moses? Yeah, he was still Moses, even though he had the veil, even though he had the mask over his face, even though he had that disguise. No, he was always Moses. He just added another layer to conceal or disguise this glory that was shining from him. And so how did Yeshua conceal or veil or deprive of force his equality with God? What does this passage say? Let me go back to that. He took upon him the form of a slave, of a servant. He put on flesh. And because he was willing to do that, what was he able to do as a result? He was able to, like the tabernacle, he was able to dwell among his people. He was able to walk around and be among his pure people. There are numerous stories in literature, there are movies that have a similar concept to this, that are really playing off of this idea. If you have a king of a nation, a powerful king, he cannot just walk out the door anytime he wants to. We saw this with the president just a few months ago, right? Y'all remember the turmoil that came up when he wanted to walk across the street and visit a church? How many people had to be cleared out of the way? And all the turmoil that came from that, and all the criticism that came from that. A king cannot just walk out the door and start standing among the people. They have to have their guards, they have to have their entourage, their ceremony. So how is it that a king can know what the people really think of him? Because when he's out there in all his regalia, all his glory, all that stuff that a king will have, are people going to act like they normally do? Are they going to maybe speak their mind like they might want to? Not typically. Not unless they lived in this day. But, so for a king to be able to really be among them, to really hear what their thoughts are without fear of his position, so that the king will typically disguise himself and walk out among them, not with his robes, not with all of his appearances, not with his crown and all those things. He does all of that so he can walk out among them and hear their real heart and their opinion. Now, in those stories, in that literature, in those movies, just because he's in his disguise, does he ever cease being the king? No. He never stops being the king. They just may not recognize him as the king. Not everybody can see it. Again, this is the same with Yeshua. He conceals his glory behind this veil of flesh, this human likeness, so he can walk among us and show us the love and the glory of God. Because God is holy, is he not? And that nature, that holiness, is not laid aside when he became flesh. That's not something he laid aside. And that's what makes something like the belief or the doctrine, if you want to use that, of the virgin birth, something so important, something so essential. Right? If he was born just the same way as everybody else, what does that do? That puts him in the same category as us, exactly. In the sense of we are all corrupted by the fall, by sin, as the seed of Adam. But the necessity of the incarnation, the necessity of the virgin birth is saying, yes, he is here, he is flesh, but he is not being corrupted by the same thing like everybody else has. So I know we don't always like to talk about doctrine. We don't like to talk about those types of things, but some of them, not all doctrine is bad. We really need some of it to understand what's going on here, because his holiness cannot be compromised. In taking on flesh and covering the glory, Yeshua is able to walk among his people without compromising that holiness. And the question is, will we recognize him anyway? Are we going to recognize the king? That's part of that passage in John 1:14 that we usually skip over because we get so focused on the first part. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. And he says, even though he tabernacled, even though he put on this robe of flesh, even though he put on this disguise, so to speak, he says, what does he say? We looked upon his glory. Could you still see it? Could they still see it? The glory of the one and only from the Father, full of grace and truth. By faith, by belief, you can recognize him. Are we going to recognize him anyway? Can we still see the King without all the robes, without all of the entourage, the glory, and the thunder? Do we know the ways of God so well? Do we know the Word of God so well in all the ways that we can recognize it when we see it? Do we know our own failure so well that we'll recognize when someone is able to live them perfectly? What's one of the questions, one of the most important questions in all of the Gospels is, who do you say that I am? Y'all remember that? He asked that of his disciples. First he says, well, who do the people out there say that I am? And they give some answers. Well, some say, a prophet, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some, they give some various answers. And then he turns it and says, but what about you? Who do you say I am? Do you still recognize me? Do you know who I am? Even though I don't have all the glory, even though I don't have the thunder and the lightning and the crown and the glory, do you know who I am? And what did Peter say? You are the Mashiach. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. That becomes a question of greater and greater importance. Do you recognize the King and the King's ways live before you, even when he's been deprived of that glory in all of its force? And that's idea is that pattern. When we consider why he came into the world. Because we're talking about the purpose of the incarnation. How does Yeshua describe his purpose in his coming? Oh, these are going to show up all the time. See, I knew I was forgetting to do something. John 6, he says, for I have come down from heaven, from the mountain among the people, to tabernacle among them. Not to do my own will, but the will of the one who sent me. So he's perfectly living out the Father's will and his ways. That's unlike anybody else. And you still recognize it. He lives as the King, even though he is in disguise. He has come to do the will of the one who sent him. We can't say that. We can strive, we can work, we can try to live out our will, but are we going to do it perfectly? No. We're always going to stumble at some point. But he has come to do his will without compromise. Why did he come? Look at John 5:43. He says, I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. So he's coming in the Father's name, which means he's coming in his authority. He's coming in fulfillment of his Father's word. But why do they not receive him? Do they recognize him? No. The ones he's saying that to do not yet know or recognize who he is. They cannot see past the disguise. They can't see past the veil that is put over to know that they're actually speaking to the Messiah. They're actually speaking to the King. Why did he come? Look at John chapter 9. Yeshua said, for judgment I came into this world, so that those who don't see what? Who he is. And who don't see may see, and the ones who do see may become blind. So the whole point of this is he is going to be distinguishing. He is going to be judging based upon who can recognize him and who cannot. And there are some people who think that they can see, who think they know it all, but they really can't. They don't recognize him for who he is. Mm-hmm. And that there are those that don't see at the moment, but they will when it is lived out before them. For judgment I came into the world. Is this not language that's very similar to that of Yom Kippur? Where he is separating those who can see who he is from those who cannot. And it's not based on importance. It's not based on education. It's not based on anything like that. It's based on who do you say that I am. John 18, in the conversation with Pilate, Pilate said to him, "Are you a king then?" He's asking the right question, isn't he? But can he see it? No. He still doesn't recognize him. So Yeshua answers, "You say that I am a king. For this reason I was born. This is the purpose. This is why I came in the Incarnation. And for this reason I came into the world, so that I might testify to the truth." That's what, and Pilate's response is, so what is truth? Or what is the truth? What's going on here? What is the truth in all of this? Is that he really is the king. That's the most important truth that Pilate needed to understand, that the world needs to understand, that he came in the Incarnation. He came born of the Virgin. He came so that he might testify to the truth. The truth of who God is, the truth of our need for salvation, the truth of the provision that God has for him. You look at John chapter 12, verse 45. "And whoever beholds me beholds the one who sent me." And when you look at the word, some of the alternative understandings and translations is whoever discerns or recognizes me. Isn't that interesting? Beholds the one who sent me. He says, "As light I have come into the world, so that everyone who trusts in me should not remain in darkness. If anyone hears my words but doesn't keep them, I do not judge him, for I came to save the world, not to judge the world." His greater purpose, would he rather everyone be saved? Yeah, Peter talks about that, doesn't he? He does not desire anyone to be lost, but all to come to repentance. Right? So this is again, why did he come? He's coming as light into the darkness. So that people who are in the kingdom of darkness might be delivered. I've come as a light, and we hear his word because he came to save us. We need to hear his word, but we need to not be like these people, don't we? We need to hear his word, and instead of not keeping them, we should keep them. Because when we hear his word and we keep them, we do that because we discern or recognize who he is. And if we really understood who he is, then we would have a greater desire to hear his word and do them and keep them, because we will be saved. See, we do and keep his word and the words of his Father and the commands of the Torah. We do all of those things because we are saved, not in order to be saved. Because we do recognize him for who he is. This is similar to 1 Timothy chapter 1. It says, "Trustworthy is the saying and deserving of complete acceptance that Messiah Yeshua came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst or foremost." Purpose of the Incarnation is that those who are lost, those who are corrupted by sin, those who are in the seed of Adam and all of those things that he is not, that we might be saved. And it doesn't matter how bad of a sinner you are. That's the reassuring thing, isn't it? Isn't it reassuring that you could be the absolute worst and you could still be saved? And so when you come across anybody, when you're out there among the world and you see people and you look at them and you say, man, that person's terrible. That's the worst person. Can that person still be saved? Are they beyond the reach or the power of God? No, they're not. So you have an obligation. We have an obligation to at least reach out to them. We have that sense of hearing the words of Yeshua and at least letting them know what is available to them. What they do at that point is up to them. It's between them and God. But he came into the world to save even the worst of them. Why did he come? Look at Mark chapter 2. It's related to that. When he heard this, Yeshua said to them, those who are healthy, they have no need for a doctor, but those who are sick do. I did not come to call the righteous, but the sinful. I'm not here calling the ones that have everything perfect, right? That are exactly right with God. Because guess what? How many of those people are there in the world? There's only one in the world like that. And it's the one doing the talking. Right? There's nobody else that fits this description. Everybody else falls into this category. And so he came into the world to call us, this category, to relationship with him, to dwell among them, that he might bring them light, that he might bring them hope. Chapter 10, verse 45 of Mark says something similar. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. This is the key. Even though the king is the one with all the authority, even though the king is even in disguise and not recognized, did he know where this was going? Yes. None of this took him by surprise. He came not because he planned on enjoying the benefits of being the king. Some people like the power. Some people like being in the position because of all the attention and all the service and all the benefits that come to them. Because of that, that's not why he came. He came to serve, to give his life in payment of something that he didn't know. He paid this debt that was not even really his. And when you look at the incarnation in Hebrews chapter 2, he says, therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared the same humanity, so that through death he might break the power of the one who had the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who by fear of death were in bondage all their lives. And he's describing the purpose. Why did he come in flesh and blood? Why was he incarnated, and born? Well, it's because he shared in our humanity. Because if he didn't do that, if he didn't share in humanity, he wouldn't be able to do this. He wouldn't be able to break the power of death. He wouldn't be able to free those who were in bondage. It's the incarnation that makes all of that possible. And so for this period of time, he is covering, he is veiling, he is setting aside, laying aside that glory, that deity, all of those things that he had already. He didn't grasp and hold on to those things, but laid them aside so he could do that. Hebrews chapter 2 goes on. It says, therefore he had to be, it wasn't he could have, or he just thought it would be, this is one way. No, it says he had to be made like his brothers in all things, so that he might become a merciful and faithful Kohen Gadol, high priest, in matters relating to God, to make atonement for the sins of the people. And because he himself suffered when put to the test, he is able to help those being tested. He had to be made like us in all things. Is there anything, the only thing that we do not share with him is the sin nature. Everything else we have in common. And because of that, he became this merciful and faithful high priest. A high priest in the order of who? In the order of Melchizedek. A high priest, not from Aaron, not from Levi, but from Melchizedek, which means he is ordained as a priest under what covenant? The covenant of Abraham. He's ordained as a priest as a covenant of Abraham, under the operating and function of that. And I know I can talk about that one for a while. We talked about that during the counting of the Omer for a while. Maybe we'll talk about that another time. But he did all of that. He suffered to be able to help us when we are being tested. He does all of this. He makes atonement for us. He is our high priest and all of those things. And so ultimately, he can say this. In talking about, Satan, the enemy, he says the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. But, what does he say? I have come so that they may have life and have it in abundance. His purpose in coming down from the mountain, his purpose for setting up a tabernacle and dwelling among his people is for that reason. It was the same goal even at Sinai, even in Exodus and the Torah. He wants his people to have an abundant life. And an abundant life is a life that is lived in his presence. An abundant life is a life that is living and walking in his ways, where sin is not controlling you, defining you, master over you, but that you have only one master, and that is the King on his throne. That's the purpose of the incarnation. The incarnation is to bring us to this point where we can truly experience life for what he always intended it to be. Because right now, as good as this life can be, as enjoyable as this life can be, it's not as good as the life he wants to give. That makes sense? So when we think about the idea of the incarnation, when you think about the idea of his being born, realize the purpose in all of that. Realize why he is doing all of that. Sometimes we get so fixated on the beginning of the story, the birth and all of that. We see our culture doing this, that we don't really understand where it's going and what he is intending to do with it. Because he came to save us. He came to give us abundant life. And that is his purpose. Who is it? What did he do? He's the king. Put on a disguise for a temporary purpose. He let some people see it sometimes, even like on the Mount Transfiguration. They got to see a glimpse of, yeah, this is who I am. And when he comes again in fulfillment of all of these fall feasts, is there going to be any question who he is? No. There's not going to be any doubt. There's not going to be any question. There's not going to be any fact finders or truth detectors or anything else like that. So you know what? I don't really know if that's him or not. Because they're either going to recognize him as king. At the name of Yeshua, what's going to happen? Every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus Christ, is Lord. That's what's coming next. No more disguises. No more uncertainty. But that he might fulfill his purpose in giving us the abundant life.